All right, so today we're going deep on something I think everyone can relate to, how we make decisions, when we just don't have all the facts and the pressure's on, like when the stakes are high.
Yeah, those tricky situations.
Exactly. We'll be looking at signal detection theory. I know it sounds kind of jargony,
It does.
but it's really fascinating. And then those pesky psychological biases, the ones that can really trip us up and lead to some not so great choices.
Absolutely.
Think of this deep dive as like a toolkit for understanding your own decision-making process and even how the people around you make theirs. And to guide us, we'll be pulling from decision-making under pressure lessons from the Cold War and beyond.
A really insightful book with some incredible real-world examples. And we're going to focus on how signal detection theory plays out and then unpack some of those key psychological factors that influence all of our choices.
Okay, so let's start with signal detection theory, or SDT, to make it easy.
Yeah,
So essentially, SDT is all about making decisions in uncertain situations, right?
exactly. It's about weighing the risks of, reacting too quickly, maybe jumping the gun versus the risk of missing something crucial, something important.
Right, it's about finding that balance.
Yeah, and the theory lays out 4 possible outcomes when you're making a decision in those kind of like froggy situations, right? So the first outcome is a hit, and that means you correctly identified a real threat. There was a signal, and you detected it.
Oh, okay. Makes sense.
Then you have a miss, so that's when there was a genuine threat, but you failed to spot it.
Mm-hmm.
You missed the signal. And on the flip side, you have a false alarm. That's when you react like there's a threat, but really there isn't. It's like a misinterpretation of the situation.
Oh, I see, like jumping at a shadow.
Exactly. And lastly, you have a correct rejection.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when you correctly recognize there's no threat.
Yeah.
You see that there's no signal and you respond accordingly.
Okay, so it's about accurately sorting the real deal from the noise. And the book has this absolutely gripping example of Stanislav Petrov back in 1983. He was a Soviet military officer, and he gets this alert about potential U.S. missile launches.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he has minutes, literally minutes, to decide if he should retaliate, launch a counterattack.
Oh, my gosh. Talk about pressure.
Right. So Petrov, he starts analyzing the situation, and he's basically using signal detection theory principles, even though, it wasn't formally called that back then. He looks at the data, he considers the context, and he comes to the conclusion that it's most likely a false alarm, probably due to a satellite malfunction.
Wow. So he decided not to launch a counterattack.
He did, and his decision averted a potential nuclear war. I mean, can you imagine?
That's just incredible to think about how one person's analysis, their ability to accurately interpret a signal in a super high pressure situation prevented a global catastrophe.
Yeah.
It really highlights the weight of those kinds of decisions and the importance of getting it right.
Absolutely chilling to think what could have happened if he had made a different choice.
For sure. But the thing is, signal detection theory isn't just about, avoiding nuclear war. It's relevant in so many areas of our everyday lives.
Right. Like, how?
Well, think about a doctor diagnosing a patient. They have to decide if the symptoms they're seeing point to something serious, a real threat to the patient's health or something less severe.
So they're constantly weighing the risks of overreacting versus missing something.
Exactly. A false alarm might lead to unnecessary treatments and procedures, which, can be stressful and costly for the patient, while a miss could mean a delay in crucial care, which could have serious consequences.
Right. So it's about finding that sweet spot.
Yeah, and it's the same in the business world. Investors are always trying to distinguish between genuine opportunities, real signals for growth and profit versus risky ventures that might lead to losses.
So they're trying to avoid those false alarms.
Exactly. They want to make sure they're investing in the right places. And even in our personal relationships, we're constantly interpreting signals, trying to figure out, what someone really means by what they say or do.
Oh, yeah. Like, is this person actually interested, or am I reading too much into things?
Exactly. And sometimes we get it right. Sometimes we lead to misunderstandings, arguments, all sorts of drama.
Okay, so that's the signal part. Now let's get into the detection, the psychology behind how we actually perceive and process those signals and how it can get messed up.
Yeah, because it's not always straightforward.
Right. The book talks about cognitive dissonance. What's the key takeaway there for our listeners?
Well, cognitive dissonance is basically this uncomfortable feeling we get when we hold conflicting beliefs. Like when we believe one thing, but we do something that contradicts that belief, or when our actions just don't align with our values.
Okay, I can see how that would be uncomfortable.
And to reduce that discomfort, We often try to rationalize our decisions, even if those decisions weren't the best ones.
So we try to make ourselves feel better about the choice we made, even if deep down we know it wasn't the right one.
Exactly. And this ties into another concept. The book talks about the sunk cost fallacy. That feeling of, well, I've already invested so much time, money, effort, I can't quit now. Even if it's clear that, continuing down that path is only going to lead to more losses.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely been there. It's like throwing good money after bad.
Exactly. The book uses the example of someone continuing to pour money into a failing business, even though all the signs point to, it's time to cut their losses, but they just can't bring themselves to admit that their initial investment was a mistake.
It's like they're trying to avoid that feeling of regret.
Right. And what's fascinating here is how our minds try to protect our sense of consistency. We want to believe that we make good decisions, so we try to justify our past choices, even if it means, digging ourselves deeper into a hole.
It's like our ego gets in the way of making a rational decision.
Absolutely. And then there's another bias that can really trip us up, the fundamental attribution bias. This is where we tend to jump to conclusions about why someone did something based on their personality or character,
Right.
rather than considering the circumstances they were in.
Oh, I see. So, like, if someone cuts you off in traffic, you might immediately think, what a jerk, instead of considering maybe they're rushing to the hospital or something.
Exactly. The book gives a great example in a workplace setting. If an employee misses a deadline, a manager might automatically label them as lazy or incompetent without considering, maybe they had an overwhelming workload or were dealing with a personal crisis, or maybe there was a miscommunication about the deadline.
Right. So it's about considering the context before making a judgment about someone's character.
Exactly, because this bias can lead to some really unfair judgments,
Yeah.
and it can prevent us from actually addressing the root cause of the problem.
So it's not just about misreading signals from the outside world, but our own internal biases can also distort how we perceive and react to information.
Yeah, our own minds can be our biggest obstacle sometimes.
And the book also touches on self-justification, how we rationalize past decisions, even when they were clearly wrong.
And this is so important to recognize because if we can't acknowledge our mistakes, if we're always trying to justify them, we can't learn from them.
Right. It's about being honest with ourselves about where we went wrong so we can do better next time.
Exactly. Recognizing our tendency to self-justify allows us to be more objective about our decisions and to course correct when needed.
So to sum it all up for our listeners, we've seen how signal detection theory, this framework, helps us think about weighing risks in uncertain situations, and how psychological biases like cognitive dissonance, the sunk cost fallacy, and the fundamental attribution bias can really cloud our judgment. Understanding these concepts gives us a powerful lens for analyzing our own decision-making processes in both our personal and professional lives.
They're like having a new set of glasses to see the world and ourselves more clearly.
Exactly. And it can help us make better, more informed choices in the future.
Absolutely. And now I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. Think about a recent decision you made, big or small. It could be anything, really. Now looking back through the framework of signal detection theory, were you more prone to false alarms? Overreacting or misses failing to spot something important? And considering those psychological principles we discussed, were any biases at play in your decision-making process? What can you learn from this reflection? How can this new understanding help you make better choices moving forward?
That's a great question. Something for all of us to think about.
I hope so.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive,
It was a pleasure.
and we'll see you next time.
Until then.